In this part of the world, the Middle East and Africa, focused on Israel, United States, maybe Britain. When it comes to the United States, I wish to repeat the answer I gave before, that the United States government does not have the competence to control things. Over the last 40 years, the United States has experienced a series of incredible failures of intelligence. They failed to see the Iranian Revolution coming. They failed to understand what was happening in Afghanistan. They failed to understand the issue of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They failed to understand what would happen if there was an invasion of Iraq. They failed to understand 9/11, and now they are failing to understand the Arab Spring and failing to understand the Islamic State. When I say they are failing, what I mean is that the people who are in government in the United States, who are in charge of making decisions and setting policies, are poorly educated when it comes to this part of the world. It is true that they do things, but they do not understand the consequences of what they are doing, and they usually do not have enough knowledge to make better decisions. I say this partly because I know many of these people. Some of them are my students. The president of Afghanistan is my student. The recent American ambassador from Israel to the United States was one of my students. People in the National Security Council in America have been my students. I feel that I have failed to teach these people how to make good decisions. So it's my fault. Afterwards, why I didn't talk about how the Islamic State is a creation of Israeli intelligence. And my answer to that was, it's not. But these two questions reflect a very important aspect of today's conflicts, which is an assumption that there are controlling forces secretly manipulating what is happening in the world, and those forces are mostly from Western countries or from economic powers, and I want to speak to that for a minute or two. So I want to talk about history because while we all think we know the history of Islam, in fact, usually what we know is influenced by what we want that history to be. When the Prophet Muhammad died,
اللهم صل وسلم عليه,
the community lost its contact with God. There would never be again someone who was speaking directly or receiving messages directly from God. This is the greatest loss that any community can ever have. The Holy Quran does not tell you what to do next. It was a matter of the people at the time deciding what they should do next. And to simplify things, their thinking went in two directions. In one direction, they said that the family of the Prophet, particularly Ali ibn Abi Talib and his sons, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, that they should be the leaders of the community. And another way of thought was that the community should choose, in some fashion, a leader who did not have to be from that particular family, although they thought they should come from the Quraysh tribe of the Prophet. Those people who believed that the leadership of the community should go to a member of the Ahl Bayt, a descendant of Ali ibn Abi Talib, came to be called Shiites, from the phrase Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali. It is easy in history to identify who the Shiites are. It's very difficult to identify who the Sunnis are, even though they are the great majority. Because while the Shiites have a very particular concept of how leadership should move from one generation to the next, within Sunni Islam, the notion of a caliph, that is to say, of a single leader of the Muslim Ummah, the notion of a caliph was a changing notion. It did not have a clear and effective definition. If you read a book on political science of Islam, it will define what a caliph is and what a caliph does. But if you read history, you find out that after the first 200 years, the caliphs didn't do that. Most of the power of the caliphs, by 300 or 400 years, had fallen into the hands of military leaders and was no longer in the hands of a single spiritual leader. In theory, you always should have a caliph. That is a Sunni principle. And that to have a caliph, you must have a nomination of a caliph. Somebody must be put forward, and then you must have a bay'ah, an oath of allegiance that where people swear that they will follow that caliph. But in reality, usually the bay'ah was not sworn by the people. It was sworn by the qadi on behalf of the people. So a person would say, I'm the caliph, and the qadi would say, I swear my allegiance to you, and then everyone was encompassed. But this did not produce an effective government. I want to mention a concept that I call the Muslim South. If you take the latitude of Medina, which is 19 degrees north latitude, I think 19, maybe 21. Anyway, if you take that latitude, I am going to define all Muslims who live south of there as the Muslim South, and all the Muslims who live north of there as the Muslim North. Most of the people in the Muslim South, that is in Africa, south of the desert, in India, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, most of these people converted to Islam after the year 1300. The Muslims in the north mostly converted to Islam at an earlier date. By 1300, there was no caliphate. So that people in the Muslim South, as Muslims, they say the history of our religion has a political institution known as a caliphate. But they come from families that never experienced a caliphate, because the caliphate had died. The last caliph was killed in 1258 by the Mongols. The great majority of all the Muslims in the world today are in the Muslim South. The history we write is almost entirely of the Muslim North. People do not realize that the greatest success of Islam in winning souls through conversion came after the caliphate was gone. Islam is a successful faith not because it had conquests led by a caliph, but because people in different parts of the world were able to convince their neighbors that they should adopt Islam. That is the truth of Islam in the Muslim South. But it's a truth that we rarely talk about because our history books focus on politics and war. They don't focus on conversion and the growth of faith communities. Themselves as being part of an ummah. Most of them were not literate. They did not read history. There were a few who became ulama and who could tell them things. But how did they experience belonging to one ummah that stretched from China to Senegal? The main way they did this was to go on Hajj. Going on Hajj becomes much more important after 1300 than it was before 1300. Let us say before 1200, Mecca was a very small place. There was no place to stay. You came, you performed the Hajj rituals, and you left. But by 1300 or 1400, it was possible to go there and stay for several years and study in a madrasa and become part of a Sufi tariqa. And that was where Muslims met other Muslims. That is where a man from Kenya or a woman from Kenya could meet someone from China or from Indonesia or from Morocco. That was the real experience that people had of Islam as one ummah. Not because there was a caliph. There was no caliph. There was no unified state. Now, earlier we have occasionally used the word khidmah, meaning service. And khidmah is one of the wonderful words in Arabic relating to Islam, because it focuses upon the degree to which Muslims are concerned and involved with the welfare and the situation of fellow Muslims. But there's a special kind of khidmah that comes into being around the year 1200. And it is the khidmah related to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And the person who carries out the service of Mecca and Medina is called Khadim al-Haramain, the servant of the two holy places. First leader to call himself Khadim al-Haramain was Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, or Saladin in English, the great Muslim leader at the time of the Crusades who took Jerusalem from the Muslims. His family set up a ruling dynasty in Egypt and Syria, and they used the title Khadim al-Haramain because Salahuddin had control of Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem. And his family controlled Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, al-Quds. So the idea of a Khadim al-Haramain, someone who was not a caliph, who was not even an Arab. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi was Kurdish. Someone who had no connection with the tribe of Quraysh, nevertheless becomes the most important ruler. because he is the person that the pilgrims who go on Hajj find out about, because he is in control of the Hajj. When the family of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi fell from power in 1250, they were replaced by a series of sultans called Mamluks, and they took the title Khadim al-Haramain, and they took over in Mecca and Medina. They did not use the title Caliph. There was a Caliph for a while in Cairo under the Mamluks, but he was not called Khadim al-Haramain. It was only the general who was in charge, who was the servant of the two holy places. When the Mamluks fell from power in 1517, and the Ottomans took over, the title the Ottomans used was not Caliph, it was Khadim al-Haramain, because for them, controlling the pilgrimage was not simply a matter of khidmah, not just a matter of servicing the holy places, but it was the place where all of the pilgrims saw who was the most important leader in the Muslim world. So what I'm arguing is that the word caliph falls out of significant political use, but the notion of controlling the holy places of Mecca and Medina, which had not been terribly important in the early centuries of Islam. Indeed, there was a period when the caliph did not even control Mecca and Medina. But it becomes the most important indicator of who the greatest power in Islam is and who represents the Muslim Ummah. Today, who is the Khadim al-Haramain? It's the King of Saudi Arabia. This title was adopted. It was not the first title used by the King of Saudi Arabia. First they called themselves Royal Highness, but now they call themselves Khadim al-Haramain. Everyone who has taken over in Mecca and Medina has destroyed all of the buildings built by their predecessors and built new buildings. So the Mamluks destroyed the Ayyubi buildings and built Mamluk buildings. The Ottomans destroyed the Mamluk buildings and built Ottoman buildings. The Saudis have destroyed all of the Ottoman buildings and now have built the second tallest building in the world is in Mecca. And no one but Muslims know about it because it's really meant to impress Muslims, not to impress the rest of the world. Now, you have to understand that in the political world of today, Saudi Arabia considers itself the single most important country in Islam, the leading country, not just because Muhammad was born in Arabia, but because the kings of Saudi Arabia are Khadim al-Haramain. And the pilgrimage now has become the most important expression of unity in Islam. The centrality of the policies of Saudi Arabia in the Muslim world is maybe the most important fact today in terms of these historical influences that are affecting the world. It takes the form not simply of being a Khadim al-Haramain. It also takes the form of using vast amounts of money to build Muslim communities in different parts of the world, whether it is Belgium or Ethiopia or Philippines. Wherever there are Muslims, there will be Saudi money. Now, many people, particularly in the United States, say, this is bad because they are Wahhabis, or as they prefer to call themselves, Muwahhideen. But it wouldn't make any difference if they are Mu'tazilis, if they were Ash'aris, if they were Hanafis, the important thing is that they are Saudis. And it is the determination of the Saudi monarchy to use its position as center of the Muslim world in a way that they feel will benefit all Muslims, that will help Islam. They're not evil, usually, but they are trying to influence things. Now, for most of the period from the discovery of oil onward, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in the 1930s. It didn't begin to be produced in great quantities until the 1960s. And it was produced by an American oil company, Aramco. From the beginning of the oil era on, the Saudis saw America as their most important ally for advancing the interests of the state, the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. America wanted to do everything for the Saudis because this was where American oil was coming from and where the world's wealth was going after the oil price rises of 1974. So Saudi Arabia did not have to do a lot in order to advance its goal of being the center of the Muslim world. But then, in 2003, the Saudis began to think that America was shifting to the Shia, and that they were going to stop being the ally and the mechanism of Saudi supremacy, but they were going to start supporting the Shia, because in the war in Iraq, the election system that was established by the Americans gave power to the Shia. From an American point of view, this made no sense. America, the government, those idiots, they thought that they were against the Shia in Iran, but then they were for the Shia in Iraq, even though the Shia in Iran and Iraq are the same thing. So there was a complete incoherence. So for a long time, America did not understand that the Saudis were becoming more and more unhappy with America. America was primarily interested in oil, obviously, but in terms of alliances, the only alliance that has ever mattered is the alliance with Israel. And America has always thought that as long as Israel is safe and powerful and rich and successful, that is a success for Americans. But we should have been paying attention and managing our relation with Saudi Arabia better. Because what is emerging now is if the Saudis think that America is becoming pro-Shiite, then you have a struggle between Saudi Arabia and the Shiite-American alliance. This is part of this historical sequence that is influencing the way things are going now. And oddly enough, it's creating a situation where in the few years to come, Israel and Saudi Arabia will become allies. Because Israel is against Iran, Saudi Arabia is against Iran, the United States is in favor of Israel and of Saudi Arabia, but we are not able to come up with a policy that is coherent in this area. The Shia, for most of its history, has been a community divided into different minorities with different theories as to which member of the family of Ali is entitled to be the imam. Here in Kenya, I believe the only significant Shia community is the Ismaili community. they have a version of Shiism that is completely different from the version in Iran. There are no strange, violent factions carrying out odd terrorist attacks in the Shia. It's held together by a very strongly integrated body of fuqaha, of religious jurists. At the same time, Sunni Islam, which originally had been united under the Caliphate, became increasingly separated from the government. And in the early 20th century, Sunni Islam began to experience a great period of innovation and, I shouldn't say innovation, that's good, I don't mean that. A great period of efforts to modernize or rethink Sunni Islam. There were people back in 1900 who said, well, let us reopen the gate of ijtihad. Let us allow Sunnis, who are thoughtful, learned people, to think new thoughts about Islam. That was perhaps a good thing. The problem is that nobody said which of the new thoughts should be followed by the Sunnis. So you ended up having dozens of different interpretations of Islam, some of which led to violent organizations, some of which led to democratic organizations, some of which wanted to revise the Quran, some of which wanted to rethink the Hadith. There are many, many different interpretations. By the 1930s, anyone who was publishing a Muslim newspaper or a Muslim magazine would have a column on iftah. You could write to the editor of the magazine and ask a religious question, and he would write an answer. But you didn't know whether the editor had any qualifications. And many of the most important new thinkers in Islam were not fuqaha, were not people trained in the madrasa, but they were journalists. And they were coming up with new ideas, but without any firm means of establishing which ideas were the best. So Sunni Islam becomes increasingly disunited. After 9/11, the editors of Time magazine, which was the most important news magazine in the United States, decided that they did not understand anything about Islam, which was true. And they decided they would devote an afternoon to having experts on Islam talk to them about what Islam was. I was the only one invited of the 5 who was not a Muslim. And I asked a question. I said, of my colleagues, I said, who do Muslims look to for religious leadership? And the first person to answer was a man from Saudi Arabia. He said, that's an easy question. The Qadi and the Mufti are the people you look to for religious leadership. But then the man from India said, well, not really, because we don't always have Qadis and Muftis. It's more complicated. Then the Muslim from Switzerland, a man named Tariq Ramazan, said, well, it's both the ulama and the leading members of the community. They should come together. And then the Palestinian from England said, the leader of Islam is whoever the Shabab think is the leader in their neighborhood. So there you had, in 2001, the spectrum of Sunni Islam. At one end, you had a Saudi notion of traditional institutions, and at the other end, you have the Shabab. Not the Somali Shabab, the Palestinian Shabab. Or Shabab all over the place, just means young men. But it was saying that they should follow whoever they think is the leader. This is a chaotic situation. It is the reason we have literally hundreds of small Muslim organizations, many of which are frustrated, oppressed, subject to police treatment, and are becoming violent. So this is an interesting situation. You have a united Shia world and a disunited Sunni world after hundreds of years in which you had a disunited Shia world and a united Sunni world.